Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Lalwani Lounge. Joining us today is a published author and a ghostwriter, Katrina Woody. Hey, Katrina. How's it going? How are you?
Jay, thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So right before this podcast, we were actually talking about, the influence of Indian cultures and religion in the Western world, including your name, Katrina, which for most people is actually very Indian sounding. And you were telling me that it does not have an Indian origin?
No, it doesn't. I mean, there might be some sort of something that I'm not aware of, but I always thought my name was a diminutive of Catherine, which comes from Greek, and I've always been told that my name is Katrina from Greek, meaning pure. However, I recently learned that there is a goddess by the name of Hecate. And I've known about Hecate for quite some time. She's very big in like neo-paganism and like New Age type of religious beliefs in Wiccan. A lot of Wiccans believe in the mother, the maiden, and the crone. So the goddess of three, which is Hecate. So it turns out that Hecate is not just the goddess of magic and the goddess of maidenhood, motherhood, and the older age for women. She is much, much more than that, and she actually comes from Thrace, so modern day Turkey. Some would say also Macedonia and Greece as well. But she was taken basically from Thracian religion and brought over into the Greek pantheon, and that's how you ended up with Catherine and Katerina and Ekaterina and Katrina and all the other diminutives.
So there's a thing, right? That like when Genghis Khan was the ruler and he was spreading out his entire empire into Mongolia, that some of his descendants also came into India. So the Babur, who I believe was the grandson or somewhere like in his lineage, that came and conquered India. So I'm guessing because there was influence of Mongolia in Turkey as well, and like parts of Greece, maybe they brought the name Katrina into the Indians. So instead of it being an influence, or it being an influence to the world, maybe the name Katrina was something that was brought into India from somewhere else, and then
it's definitely possible. I mean, with Alexander the Great, especially going into what's modern day northern India and Afghanistan and other parts of what we consider East or Southeast Asia. There's definitely the possibility that was brought.
Yeah, it's interesting, just like the religious factor that we were talking about, in how Christianity has a lot of influence from Buddhism.
Yeah.
And considering, like, based on historical records, Buddha was born somewhere in the 560 BC time, and Buddhism came after that. He was actually born into a Hindu family. He was a Hindu prince.
Oh yeah, I do remember. I remember hearing about that.
Yeah, his name was Siddhartha Gautam, and then Buddha was a title given to him by the people that were following him. So he gained his enlightenment under the big enlightenment tree, and then which is called Bodhi Vriksha, basically is enlightenment tree, and then that's where his entire journey started, and then there was influence. There's said that there's influence of Buddhism in Syria, Greece, and Egypt, which might have had some influence in the shaping of other religions that came after.
Sure.
Right. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I definitely have heard a lot of hypotheses that Jesus had traveled to India and had learned about Buddhism while he was traveling in India. I've also heard that Jesus had some influences from Krishna, or that Krishna and Jesus were perhaps the same deity. So there's definitely overlap there. Now, my one concern would be that Judaism predates 560 BC or so. At least to my knowledge, I could be wrong on the dates, but as far as I know, Judaism and Moses would predate all of that, meaning that the religion that, like the Abrahamic religions, would have been established prior to Siddhartha gaining his enlightenment and traveling to Egypt and putting those influences together. But because of globalization and because of the incense road, which predates the Silk Road, there's definitely been way more globalization in ancient times than we ever would have imagined.
Right. So there's information of one of the Indian kings, Ashoka, also practicing Buddhism a little bit, and then also sending his missionaries, his Buddhist missionaries to Greece, Syria, and Egypt, and Moses being from Egypt, may or may not have. Well, actually, if Judaism came before that, he may have not heard it back then, but it could have helped in shaping maybe the modern day Judaism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's definitely merit to that, and we don't really know when Moses lived, right? So we can trace back Judaism back to around 500 BC. So the timelines are close, but we don't know an exact date for when Moses would have written the Old Testament or the Torah.
Right, but if we consider Moses around the same time as Jesus.
No, not as Jesus, as Buddha.
As Buddha.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and Jesus came way after.
Yes,
So
that's what, 600
0
years?
BC.
Yeah, 600 years from Moses to Jesus, essentially. Right. So, Jesus probably would have been influenced directly by Buddhism, even if Moses himself had not been.
Right.
So Jesus was a Jew above all else, right? So he would have been a rabbi, and because rabbi is the word for teacher. So no matter how we translate the Bible, from Greek or Aramaic or Latin or whatever other language you might be translating it from into English, it's always going to be teacher. And people forget that. People forget that Jesus was a rabbi and that he was Jewish. And he, in my opinion at least, did not set out to create Christianity. Rather, he set out to reform Judaism and create something that was less corrupted, because there's a lot of power dynamics and a lot of power struggles, and religion can often be used to create that power vacuum. And so with that power vacuum, there was a lot of corruption, and Jesus was really trying to get everybody back to God rather than creating this whole new Christian religion that was all about him being the Son of God.
Right. So then that makes sense, right? So in terms of timeline, you have Moses that lived, and then you had Buddha that lived around this. Both of them kind of lived around the same time, and then there was a lot of exchange of these religious ideas, or maybe even philosophies. Maybe they weren't even developed into like mature religions at that time. And then you had the Silk Route, where there was a lot of information exchange along with trade, right? So that is definitely one of the things that was something on my mind that I was thinking, and that's why I wanted to have this discussion with you, Katrina, who does not have an Indian origin name, but
unfortunately, I can't claim it.
Yeah, but well, you were talking about this power vacuum, right? And I was talking to one of my friends about this. I actually also spoke about this on a different podcast. But the idea of religion being a 3-part thing, where you have the first part, which is the philosophy. It's the origin of ideas, and it goes through its own process of peer review per se,
sure.
Right? So it does have its peer review, and then a group of people agree to a certain set of ideas, making it like a group philosophy, right? And then they start living by this philosophy, be it like things that did not form a religion, like Stoicism, right? It did not form into a religion, but it was still a philosophy. There's like documented people like Aristotle or Plato that kind of lived by it, or lived by it, right, back in the day. So those did not turn into religion, but they were still philosophies, right? So that would be for me, that would be where it all starts, and then you have this other layer of of conformance or guidelines or things that come on top of it to unite a bigger group of people into, for lack of a better word, cult.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? Not in any negative way, but like a big organization of people.
If you go by just the dictionary definition of cult, like any religion is going to be a cult,
right?
And it doesn't have to be a negative connotation like what we use in the modern era, but I think it's an appropriate word.
Yeah, just like the word argument, right?
Sure.
It could be a point or
a discussion.
A discussion. Right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so that would be like the set of guidelines that go around it, and uniting the masses based on similar ideas, or the need to change or the want to change certain aspects of society or how we live or how they feel that it would be a better society, right? And then the third layer, which is not the fun layer, but that layer would be essentially people using religion for power.
Right.
Like, so that layer essentially is how you use religion to control the masses or like a lot of people call it oppression. A lot of people call it, faith, or people call it, there are 25,000 different
They
names.
justify, you're saying that they use religion to justify a means to an end or justify wars or whatever their actions might be.
Exactly. But you would have extremists on one side.
Sure.
That use religion in a certain way or interpret the words in a certain way to justify their actions, like you said. And at the same time, you would have the other group of people that would instigate a certain group of people for their advantage. And there's like politics involved, there's like so many different things involved, and all of that has to do with people in power wanting to be in power, or people that are not in power trying to achieve power.
Right.
Like, even if we consider India, during the East India Company era, like before they were colonized, the British used the conflict between the Hindus and the Muslims to create a divide between them, so that 150 British soldiers essentially took over a country, right? And like, it's just like a handful of people, and they took over the country for 150 years by creating this religious divide. Right.
And that happens all the time. I mean, we've seen it in the modern era. We've seen it in Iraq, for example, between the Sunnis and the Shia. Prior to 2003, there was very, very few conflicts because, like Saddam or not, Saddam had an iron fist, and his people knew that they could only do certain things. But now there's divides between every neighborhood, and you have to go Sunni neighborhood, Shia neighborhood, and there's people who are stopping people in Baghdad from going into certain neighborhoods, or there's hatred amongst people who were childhood friends, and now they're like, oh, I can't go to his house because he's Shia, or I can't go to his house because he's Sunni. So I mean, it's in tales all the time, honestly.
It's such an interesting thing that it all starts with a good idea, good philosophy, like, hey, do no harm to people, don't lie, don't kill people. The 10 Commandments is something that is pretty common, or something very similar is very common across all philosophies that go around. Like, I'm not talking about just religion,
sure,
but all philosophies around the betterment of lives, right? And it all ends up with these layers that come on top of it, and then people make their own translations
to justify their means. And now I will say that it's almost like a chicken and egg situation, I think. So like, you laid it out in the 3 prongs, right? Philosophy first, and then like kind of rules and regulations, and then power dynamic.
I would not call them rules. I would call them guidelines.
Okay, so there is a subtle difference between rules and guidelines. For me personally, I think of them more as rules because they do tend to be very rigid, right? And especially if we're talking about first century Christianity or the Code of Hammurabi. Those were like an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, do unto others as you would have done unto you. Things like that. Now, those don't really have any nuance, right? Like, you steal, the Code of Hammurabi says, like, you steal something, your left hand gets chopped off. Like, there's no in between. But to me, like, religion, I don't know if it necessarily came first or if the philosophy came first, because if you look at Moses, he led his people out of Egypt after being enslaved for many, many years. And he went up onto Mount Sinai and he got the tablets, he got the 10 Commandments. And then he told his people, like, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, thou shalt not steal, etc. And he and his people believed in God long before those commandments came to be. So he had this religion and this connection to God prior to getting his rules and regulations, or his guidelines, if you will. And yet these guidelines are really what ended up shaping most of the Abrahamic religions, and they've survived to this day and are still so incredibly important. But it's really all just to control the people. So if you're guiding, say, 40,000 Jews out of the desert after being enslaved for 100 years, there's still going to be infighting, right? There's going to be people who say, oh, well, Moses, you were raised by the Pharaoh. Like, why should you be the one to lead us out? Why should you be the one, like, you don't actually have a better connection to God than I do. So you're going to have a lot of fighting. And so perhaps there were murders. I mean, this is, extrapolating a little, or a lot, but like, you don't know what was going on. Like, why did Moses decide that was the time that he needed to present these rules of God? Or why did God decide that particular moment, fleeing the Egyptians, going back to the promised land, was the time to present these rules to live by? And for me personally, I think it's a very convenient thing to just say, oh, well, God gave me these tablets. They were destroyed because I did something wrong, so you can't see them. But suddenly, you aren't allowed to have an affair with your neighbor's wife. You aren't allowed to murder people. You aren't allowed to steal. So I do think that a lot of religion is just to control and to make sure. I mean, some people can't control themselves without these guidelines or these rules, and that's okay. You see this all the time with addicts. Like, you see this like in the 12-step program, like with AA, right? AA is a Christian organization. They have all these 12 steps, and you have to atone for your sins. Like, you have to apologize to people that you've hurt when you go through that program. But these are all rules, and often people who are recovering addicts become very religious, and their new addiction is religion. And in my opinion, that's simply because they have to have that structure, otherwise they relapse. And good for them if they found something that is a healthy way to get over their addiction. But it all comes back to these rules and guidelines that are surrounded by faith.
Do you think that's a healthy way?
I was trying to be nice
so
because I don't want to offend anybody, but for me personally, no, I don't think it's necessarily healthy to have an obsession with anything, or an addiction to anything. But I don't struggle with addiction, so I can't talk. I can't really speak to that because that's not my experience. But I do think it's healthier than shooting up heroin.
Fair. But one of the things that I want to pull out of what you said is if we actually separate religion and power, right, or religion and control, religion at its core does give you some great insights into what people have already learned. It's like, say for example, you invented the wheel, right? And then you wrote a user manual on it, right? And then you passed it to somebody else, and then they were like, do I reinvent the wheel, quote unquote, or do I just use whatever is in this manual and build a wheel, right? So like, if you consider some of the things like the light bulb, right? The design primarily has not changed since Graham Bell made it.
But there were many other iterations before Graham Bell.
But his design is something that survived.
True, because it was one that worked.
Right. And then you have certain other things that we have invented, reinvented, and like went through multiple iterations to get to where it is today, right? So I would say that religion could be considered as one of the things where there was somebody or a group of people that achieved some sort of enlightenment, right? And then not everybody was trying to achieve enlightenment at that time. They were all busy with whatever they were doing, right? And then they came up with, like, after peer review, they came up with a set of things that they could pass on as a user manual of how to at least have a decent life, which is surrounded by family and, like you have the 5 pillars of a good life, and one of them is community, right? Okay, so it's like water, so hydration.
Are you talking about Pavlov's like laws of like comfort, or I don't know what to call it?
So it's like 5 pillars of a good life, and they're mentioned in multiple places, including a lot of old ancient Egyptian texts as well. It revolves around how you can achieve like good mental health.
Okay.
And one of the things is like you have water, you have food, you have water, food, sleep, community, and exercise.
Interesting.
So out of these 5, you have one that is community, right? So religion could also be, or maybe was, a way to unite people under a same idea where you could essentially then form society and live in peace and harmony without killing people, without,
No, I mean, there's definitely merit to that for sure. Like, when we were hunters and gatherers, it was very, very tribal, and so things that would have created a community, a sense of community, even belonging to other tribes, would have been religion for sure. Like, I recently watched a documentary, and by recently I mean like 4 years ago, so it's a little hazy, but the largest and oldest pyramid in the world is located in modern day Missouri, and it was built by the Native Americans. Because the Native Americans, even though they belonged to different nations, different tribes, these indigenous peoples would come, like, I think it was every 5 years, maybe every 8 years. There was something significant, but all roads led to, instead of all roads leading to Rome, all roads led to this pyramid in modern day Missouri. And so that definitely created a sense of community for the native tribes. And they would put down their weapons. Like, there was a lot of infighting between the Native Americans, as there are with any tribal system or any people from throughout the world, throughout history. But they would put down their weapons for this particular, 5 or 8 year reunion, and they would go and they would, feast and have a wonderful time. So, I mean, to your point, yes, like, there's definitely a sense of community within religion, but again, you can't have that sense of community without those rules and regulations, because who's to say that when you gather for, say, the winter solstice, that you aren't going to take that opportunity to kill all of your enemies? So you have to have that rule set in place of, this is a place of worship, this is not a place of bloodshed. Or if it is a place of bloodshed, we're actually just going to be, sacrificing some goats.
So question.
Okay.
Right? So who maintains, or who ensures that these rules are followed? A governing body.
Sure.
Like, somebody has to govern, right?
Right.
So now they are specifically in power.
Yeah.
And they get to shape how they want to shape their society.
Yeah.
Like, we have courts today, we have Congress today, that does the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of religious ideas they use in lawmaking as well.
That's true.
Right?
That's true.
So is that like something that would be a religious problem, or the problem of the governing body that say, like, okay, I want to control these people better. So do I make laws? See, laws are built on top of the religion.
I think that we're looking at it from a very modern perspective. So I think we're looking at it from a lens of 2023, where government is separate from religion. But that hasn't always been the case. And even today, there are plenty of places that don't have separation of church and state the way the United States does. Saudi Arabia, for example, is a theocracy. Iran is another theocracy. I'm sure there are others, but those are the 2 that come to me off the top of my head. So Sharia law in those 2 countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia, even though they practice 2 different types of Islam, they are practicing their religious law. It is not separated. Whereas in the United States, our founding fathers, they wanted that separation of church and state. They wanted religious freedom for everybody. And while this is not a popular opinion, this is historical fact. Our founding fathers were secular. Our founding fathers were not Christ first people. They were not Christian first or God first. They were secularists. They were probably agnostic at best and almost certainly atheist. So we can't say that from like a US 2023 standpoint that religion and government are separate, because that's just not how it was historically. And again, we can find examples of that today.
Yeah, well, what I was getting to as like, so if we have a religious king, or a religious monarch,
sure,
right? In that sense, like you still have a governing body, or like the king and the people that work for the king that are maintaining law and order. So even if it's not segregated, like in 2023 United States, right? But even if you smudge them, you still there is a differentiation between religious ideas and people creating the rules.
Sure, I mean, look at Henry VIII. Henry VIII created a whole new religion just so he could divorce his wife.
Exactly.
And then kill, and then divorce, and then die. But you know.
We're going on a tangent.
but no, I mean, that's to your point, right? So even if it is a tangent, like this was 500 years ago, so again, it's looking back historically and not really through the 2023 gaze, but Henry VIII he was the head of the church. He wasn't always the head of the church. The Pope was the head of the church, because even though Martin Luther came, 70 years before Henry VIII, and he had created the Reformation for Lutheranism in Germany, that really hadn't spread too far. And Henry VIII really revolutionized a lot of the religion, and that's why we have Protestantism, and that's why we have the United States, because of the Puritans who came out of that Protestant schism. But the reason why he did that was because who had all the power? It was the Holy Roman Emperor, and it was the Pope. So they had all of the power possible, and Henry felt trapped, and he felt like he couldn't do anything. So he ended up creating a whole new religion, the Anglican religion, or in America, I think it's called evangelical, I'm not sure. But there's another name for it in the US. And he made himself the head of that church. Now there was, of course, and still is, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who has control over the churches and weddings and all the things that revolve around the religion. But now King Charles III is the head of the Anglican Church instead of the Pope in the Catholic Church. So Pope Francis has no power over what the Anglicans do.
But it's still all about that power.
It is.
It is, and it is using religion for power. Like if you see a lot of this evolution, all the way from Buddhism, which is one of the oldest religions that are still practiced in modern day. Right. So
it is.
Yeah, it's one of the oldest. I don't know if it is the oldest, but I know it's definitely one of the oldest ones that are still practiced
top 3
today.
to 5. Yeah.
Right, because you don't follow paganism now. There's no Norse.
There is. There's a revival. I don't know if you've heard about this.
I mean,
There's
like
a revival. It's big. It's crazy. Like, I mean, it's great because I think it's fascinating.
Well, they're trying to bring back dinosaurs. Like, there's a lot of let's bring it back, but it's like
have Jurassic Park with witches.
like the popular ones, or the I should just call them popular ones, right? The ones that we know about, or are mostly practiced. The top few religions. So Buddhism would be one of the oldest ones that is still followed in like so many countries, and I think it also made its way to a lot of places in the United States. I have a couple of friends that do their chanting and everything every day.
Especially in like the New Age community, there's a lot of practicing of Buddhism and Hinduism, especially in that community.
So I don't know if you know this, but Buddha Siddhartha Gautama was actually born a Hindu.
Yes.
Yeah, he was born to a Hindu king, and then he gave up everything. That's where like there are a lot of Indians that wanted to be monks as well, like give up all earthly desires and things of those fashion, where there was this understanding that materialistic attachments leads people to get corrupt. In some shape or form, which kind of circles back and forth and in like various texts and goes like in and out, and then there's enforcement of it as well in certain places, and then it comes back as like, oh no, money is God, or like there's so many ideas going back and forth in this direction.
I do want to say that Buddhism is a fantastic philosophy, fantastic religion, but like every religion, there are extremists. I mean, we see that with Myanmar,
right?
Burma, whichever name you want to call it. We see that happening, and so I don't want to paint the picture that Buddhism is like the be all end all, because the way you just painted it is like it's very like loving and peaceful and everything. And no religion at its core is bad, right? But there's going to be extremists no matter what religion you're looking at. And I feel like there's not enough people talking about the extremists in some of the Eastern religions, such as Buddhism. And we just kind of gloss over that. And we're like, oh, you're Buddhist? You must be the most peaceful person in the world. And chances are you might be. But there's also that extreme element too.
Well, there are going to be extremists when it comes to any idea.
For sure.
Like even if you think like politics these days, right? You have the leftists, the rightists, and the moderates, right? You do have like people that are for, there are people that are against, and then there are people that are like, I can get a little bit from here and a little bit from there,
yeah.
Right? So that is something that is human nature, or I guess not just human nature, it's just animal instinct,
right.
to pick a side,
right.
or be neutral. Like that's why you have three sides. So yeah, I don't think any religion does not have extremists, right?
Yeah.
They're everywhere.
Yeah, and it can be extreme on any side too. It can be like the extreme on like the good. It can be extreme on the bad, and it's it just, like I said, it's just something that's not really talked about, and I feel like people really need to understand, especially here in the U.S., that people just have these stereotypes that they think about when they think of, I think, Buddhism in particular.
Right. Well, there are stereotypes about a lot of religions.
Yes.
So we probably don't want to even get into that, but
that would be a long conversation.
Yes,
go over
but there are stereotypes everywhere. There's stereotypes between you and your friends. They might even if they're in the same religion, but maybe from a different village or a different town, we have stereotypes against that. So we do a lot of things to discriminate between people or differentiate ourselves from other people.
Absolutely.
I shouldn't use the word discriminate, but differentiate ourselves from other people. And maybe I feel religion was designed to unite these people under the same roof. Like, hey, you might be different here, you might be different here, but together, either we're praying to a deity, or either we're doing something of that sort where we unite, or we come to a specific temple, or like you said, we meet at a pyramid after every 5 years and sing Kumbaya.
Right, but that's also one of the ways that religion gets upgraded throughout time too. So Jesus, we know of him as being kind of like the very first hippie, right? Like we think of Jesus like that, where all he wants is peace, love, and harmony, which is kind of ignoring certain things about his personality. Like we see him flipping the table inside of the temple when he sees tax collectors taking money from people as they're on their way to synagogue on a Friday night. So he wasn't always about peace, love, and harmony, because he did have a lot of anger when people were mistreating his faith. But you also see that there's there's influences in Jesus from other cultures. Like there's, I wrote them down because I didn't want to get the names wrong, but there's like Attis, who is a Greek god, who shares a lot of the similarities with Jesus. There was Horus, who was an Egyptian god, who shares a lot of similarities with Jesus. Buddha, sometimes people talk about how Buddha and Jesus share a lot of similarities. Same thing with Aten, I think is Aten, was an Egyptian god who, there was Akhenaten was a Egyptian pharaoh based in Thebes it was around 3000 BC during the New Kingdom of Egypt. And he and his wife, Nefertiti, decided to move the entire capital out of Thebes to a place that's now called Amarna, which in modern day Egypt. And they moved the whole society there, made them monotheistic to worship Aten, and he was a sun god. And he was depicted in the same way that Jesus is depicted in all of the art, with like that little halo around his head, like a sun disk behind him. So there's a lot of overlap and a lot of influence of other religions on not just Christianity, but every religion. And I know also Krishna is sometimes referred to as like a Jesus-like figure, and that they have similarities. I think there was a resurrection with Krishna. I don't know if you could probably correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. So there's a story of the fact that Krishna might come back.
Okay.
So which is very similar to modern day Christianity, where there's a theory that that Jesus
the second coming.
Yeah, the second coming. I think Krishna also has one of them, and I think I could be wrong, like we could look it up, but he might come in as a flower, and as soon as that flower dies off, that's when the world will end.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that is one of the folk tales that I've heard.
Okay.
We could actually look into this. But yeah, that's the second coming.
Well,
of
that's
Krishna.
a nice way for the world to end. That is not the Christian tradition at all. Or the what's the poem? Some say the world will end in fire, others say in ice. But from what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who say fire. But if I had to perish twice, I would go with those who say ice.
Wow, nice. That's very nice. This is my addition.
All the rhyming.
This is my addition to the poem.
Yeah. So basically, in Christian tradition, they say that when Jesus returns, when there's the second coming, there's going to be a war, basically between heaven and hell, or Satan and Jesus, and anybody who follows Jesus and has Jesus in their hearts and minds will automatically ascend to heaven, whereas those who have not accepted Jesus into their hearts and minds will, be stuck on earth and have to live out through the battles of good and evil.
Yeah. So yeah, I was actually looking up the how is he gonna come back, and it says that it's gonna be the 10th iteration. It's called the Avatar, or like it's spelled like Avatar, but it's the 10th manifestation of Krishna, which is essentially going to be.
So basically within Hindu tradition, Krishna has come back several times.
Yes. So there are many school of thoughts. One of them is that there are three primary gods. So the idea of gods has changed over multiple millennia.
Sure.
In the whole Hinduism ideology, like there are the Vedas, and then there's like these other holy books like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and then there's like specific focus on Gita, and then so on and so forth. Where in terms of Ramayana, Ram, who's specifically who's like a manifestation of God or Krishna, and so is Krishna in the Mahabharata, in which that's where the Gita comes from. Right, so you do have like a lot of manifestation of Lord Krishna, but there's a school of thought that the three gods, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, which is Brahma is the creator, Vishnu is the god that maintains life on earth, and then there is Mahesh, also known as Shiva. He's the destructor of the world. So like all the calamities and all the cataclysmic events are doings of Shiva. When he realizes that things are not going right, he creates these events which we could take a tangent into, like Noah's Ark.
There's a lot to unpack there for sure.
But yeah, that's the belief. But there's another school of thought, which is the ISKCON, which is International Society for Krishna Consciousness. They say that Krishna is not a form of Vishnu or a manifestation of Vishnu. It's the other way around, where Krishna is the supreme being, and then all the other gods are his manifestation.
Right. But there you go. You have another example of how Indian culture has impacted Christian culture or Western culture, because you have God, you have Jesus, and you have the Holy Spirit. So the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is more commonly referred to. But either way, you have that same idea of you have like one main deity, and then you have different iterations of that deity.
Right. So like in the Vedas, which are a set of texts that kind of predate even the Gita, there we have like a group of gods. I think 33 gods, and the leader of that, or the supreme god in that, is Indra, which is the god of thunder, lightning, rain, which kind of has similarities in Zeus,
right,
or Jupiter, I
yes.
think, right? Yeah. So you have like these supreme gods being rain and thunder and lightning, right?
So the most powerful of all of the gods are in control of the weather.
Right. So like the weather, like,
because I mean, even in Norse mythology, you have Odin, who is the god of thunder and lightning.
Exactly.
Or Thor, I guess is thunder.
Thor,
yeah.
So
but
Odin is the father of Thor, right?
Yes.
According to Marvel movies.
According to actual mythology, yeah.
but yeah, you see, like they're or actually, and then Odin dies, and then Thor becomes the king of Asgard, right?
I don't know if that's just in Marvel or if that's like actual. I have to say that I was watching Jeopardy one night and I got every single Norse mythology thing right because of Marvel. So maybe.
It is possible. Also, like you have Odin that has a trident.
So the trident in Greek and Roman mythology belongs to Poseidon.
Right, but Odin has the
in Norse.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in Norse you have Odin with a trident.
Yeah.
In Greek and Roman you have Poseidon and whatever the Neptune, right? So you have them having tridents. In Hindus, you have Shiva that has a trident. So like everything that's responsible for destruction by water or weather or any of that, they have a trident.
That's really interesting.
Uh-huh.
Well, the Little Mermaid's dad also had a trident, but I think he was supposed to be Poseidon.
And so did Aquaman. I don't know if we can consider them as part of this conversation, but if you go from like Odin to to Poseidon to Shiva.
Wow, yeah, that's really
they all have tridents. So even the weapon of choice kind of has like so many similarities in so many different cultures.
Right. But why does God have a weapon in the first place? Because at least according to the New Testament for the Christians, God is all-knowing and all-loving. I mean, now that is different for the Old Testament and the Torah, where God is definitely a punisher, and I will smite you if you don't follow my rules.
Mm-hmm. But so does Krishna. Krishna has like a rotating disc on his pinky finger.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called the Sudarshan Chakra. But that is also something that can be used as a weapon.
Chakra, like the head and like eye.
No, not that chakra. So chakra in Hindi or Sanskrit is also something that's circular.
Got it. Okay.
Right. So wheel would also be a chakra because it's round.
I'm not round.
So it's circular.
Oh.
A wheel.
Oh.
What did you think?
You said something like we are also round, and I'm like, I'm not round.
A wheel.
Okay.
A wheel is round.
Okay.
And that's also called the chakra.
Okay, interesting.
Right. So I think it has to do with the fact that it's circular.
So earlier in our conversation, you said that religion is kind of like the invention of the wheel, where you have rules written down, and you need to have, why would you reinvent the wheel when you have these directions? So with religion, we do reinvent the wheel kind of a lot. I mean, not always, because as we've already discussed, that we do pick up things. Somebody once told me, and I loved this, I thought this was a really great way to describe the three major Abrahamic religions, was that Judaism is like the OG, right? So it's like Windows 98. And then you have Christianity, which came just a little bit later. So that's like Windows XP. Like there's a few updates, still does like the same basic things that Windows 98 did. And then you have Islam that came in the latest. And so Islam is more like Windows 2010. It has a lot more of the upgrades, but it still has the same basic principles as the first two religions. And you can do everything that the first two religions did or believed. You just have a couple upgrades. So I always thought that was like a really, really interesting way to describe the Abrahamic religions.
I can add something to it.
Okay.
Scientology is like Windows Vista. Piece of shit. It is crap. So, you know.
So I mean, I think it's a great metaphor for the Abrahamic religions, and then of course Scientology. But when it comes to reinventing religions, we do tend to add things on. But Christianity and Judaism and any of the monotheistic religions are so different from what we would call the pagan religions, right? So they weren't called paganism, back in the day. Pagan is a Christian term that was used to describe anybody who believed in more than one God. But pagan beliefs, even though they have been, indoctrinated into Christian faith because of Constantine and the Council of Rome, just to get people more okay with becoming Christians and just leaving behind their polytheistic ways. The polytheism is just so different from the Abrahamic religions. And I assume that the Greek and Roman religions are also quite different from the Indian religions, from Buddhism and from Hinduism.
I do think there is a lot of influence and information exchange there, because Greeks and Romans Greeks and Romans have pretty similar stories for their gods.
Yes.
They just have different names for it and different timelines and whatever, right?
Yeah.
But like they have like a thunder god, they have a water god, they have a sun god. They have gods for specific events or specific things that affect us on a daily basis. Like you have sunshine, you have rain, you have tides and all of that. Similarly, Hinduism also has gods that are like, at least in the Vedas, you have these gods that actually are associated with specific elements that we're exposed to, like even and there's like influences that even when you go from the Vedas into like either Ramayana or Mahabharata, right? So if you think about Ramayana, one of the most common or prominent features apart from Ram was Hanuman. Hanuman is the monkey god, right? And like there are traces of people believing in Hanuman all the way up to Thailand. It's not just India. So you have like from Sri Lanka all the way up to Thailand. So you do have like influences everywhere, and they call him by the same name.
Okay.
Right? And there's also a school of thought that he's still alive and still protecting everyone, because he was somebody who was dedicated to protecting. Where was I going with Hanuman? Yeah, so he's considered the son of wind god. So he's called Pavan Putra Hanuman, which is the son of wind god.
Okay.
Right? So he's like, he's just like, who's Poseidon's child?
Venus?
No, like the demigod. There's so many movies on him.
Perseus?
Perseus, right? So just like the story of Perseus, that there's a god and there's a human, and then
or Hercules, or
So together you have, like, it may not be by natural ways, but you still have this connection between a god and a human and a child.
Right, like a demigod.
Like a demigod. So Hanuman was actually a demigod.
Okay.
Right?
Half human, half god.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Right? So there's like loosely translated, but everybody has their own interpretation of how this came to be, right? And then you see this idea of him being a demigod of wind, right? So wind was also considered a god, right? So these are these natural elements that people used to pray to,
Right.
And I think these gods are like as old as time because there are tablets and like monoliths found everywhere where you have like depictions of sun. There was recently a discovery, I think it was in Göbekli Tepe,
Okay.
which there's a hypothesis that it's like 11,500 years old or whatever, right? Or maybe even older than that. But there's like huge influences of serpents in certain structures, right? So even the serpent god is also considered a god, which if you bring in modern time is Osiris? No. Medusa.
Oh, yes. Well,
not Medusa, but there is.
Medusa had snakes on
right.
her head, and those snakes would kill somebody with at a glance.
Make them stone, turn them into stone,
Yeah.
right? But I think there was like a serpent god in Greek too. I think maybe
might have been a more minor god. I'm not thinking of who the serpent god might have been. Well, Hecate was definitely the goddess of serpents, but she wasn't part of like the core pantheon.
I don't know. I'll have to look it up. But there is there was something that I read a while back about it, like Greeks also having like a snake god. So did
The Mayans,
yes. Mayans and Aztecs also had serpents as gods, and it's interesting how we went from praying to all the elements that live around us, or that I would still call wind, sun, and all of them as living around us. We all have life together.
But we don't worship them the way we used to. And I think that's where the reinvention happens. So we have this reinvention of maybe it's fair to say that the polytheistic religions, and some of which still survive to today, but a lot of them have died out because of Christianity being around the Mediterranean especially. But maybe it's fair to say that any of the polytheistic religions have kind of a shared belief system, whereas the monotheistic religions reinvented that wheel and created something brand new that nobody had ever really seen before. And then once you have those monotheistic religions, the Abrahamic religions especially, so Judaism, Christianity, Islam are the three major ones, they're not really reinventing the wheel, they're just kind of adding on certain elements to add in those upgrades.
Right, but we actually went from praying to the elements, from that to praying to right. we just went from praying to the elements to praying to people, humans.
But did we? Because when we talk about God in Christianity, we say that he's omnipresent. So he's everywhere, all the time, all at once. And Jesus is often referred to as a sun god. So, and he's depicted in that way, in the same way that Atkin was depicted, in the same way that Horus was depicted, the same way that Apollo was depicted. We have all of these different sun gods from different religions and different cultures, and they're all depicted in the same way as Jesus. So did we actually go from celebrating the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the other elements around us, or did we just decide that it's all one entity? I mean, we also have to think about Rhea and Gaia, some of the very, very earliest, so Rhea was the mother of the Titans. Gaia is Mother Earth in Greek mythology. So at that point in time, Gaia was kind of the be-all, end-all. She was Mother Earth. She was the one that we worshipped for everything. And now we have that same kind of monotheistic belief system of God is everything, everywhere, all at once, which is also, I believe, the name of very good Chinese movie.
Yeah, I actually know Gaia from the Avatar movie.
Oh, I've never seen the Avatar movies, but I do love Gaia. I do like, I try to do things like on Earth Day and like summer solstice and stuff to, be thankful for the environment around me.
Right. But what I was getting to, like, we went from sun god as a depiction of sun to be depicted as a human. Like the lightning god turning from lightning and rain and thunder without a depiction into Zeus.
Right.
As a human.
Okay.
Like the depiction is human.
Right. So
like,
are you saying that like, in Egypt, for example, like with Horus and Ra and Isis and everything, they were depicted as like jackals and other, like there was like the half alligator, half man, and like there were all kinds of different things depicted for those gods, but they always had like an element with them. So they would have like a sun behind them, so to show you that it's the sun god. Whereas you're saying that today, like that's not really how we depict.
Yes, we depict all of them as humans.
But
Everything
still with
from-
those elements, because you still have like the sun behind Jesus. and
Right,
all
but you
that.
still have like Jesus, man, Krishna, man, and all like, and then you have Athena, female, like, but they're like people.
Right, but in Hinduism, isn't like there's the elephant and there's like the multi-armed.
Yes, so that's Ganesha,
Okay.
which is the
As you can
elephant
see,
god.
I know nothing about Hinduism, so.
which is the elephant god, right?
Right.
So the elephant god is still like
Human.
mostly human, and the story behind it is it was born a human, or not really born, but it was created a human, and then he loses his head, and then they attach an elephant's head to it.
Oh, okay.
So and that's how Ganesha becomes Ganesha, right? And he's Shiva's son.
Okay.
But it all ends up as like Shiva also being a person, Krishna being a person, and all the gods being people. Like that's how I don't think like.
So we're worshiping ourselves.
Yes, we're actually like the idea of there is God within us has made us so conceited that we've gone from worshiping elements to now worshiping ourselves in a way.
Interesting.
Right? And I think that is when we transition to we can use religion to now hold power. Like now we want it to be gods. Instead of worshiping gods, we now want it to be gods.
Right.
And when we wanted to be gods, and I feel that might have been where the transition of let's use religion for power. Let's see that we might have not seen God in person or whatever,
right.
But we can still use whatever we know to control the masses, get power, and stay in power.
I still think it's chicken and egg, like because.
So before you say chicken and egg, there's a solution. The egg came first. it is a scientific thing.
I don't think they've proven anything.
It is. This is how it happens in. Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson also mentions this in multiple places that. So if you think about evolution, right? So there was a bird of a different species that laid an egg with different DNA.
Yep.
That hatched into a chicken. So the egg did come first.
Okay, but that's just a hypothesis.
No, that's probably how.
Probably. That's probably.
Well, it's backed by a world-renowned scientist.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, as much as I love him, I've seen him speak in person. Not always right.
Okay, but this is the most plausible theory.
To be human is to err.
To err is to be human. Or is that what it is?
I don't actually now question myself because
to err is human.
I learned it in Latin and now I don't even I can't remember the translation nor can I remember the Latin, so I'm just all over the place.
I think it's to err is human.
Either way, I'm human. I erred.
Okay.
You're human. You erred.
Yeah, but yes. So the ant came first. Moving on.
No, but like, again, I think that in order to have a sense of community, in order to have, especially when we went from hunter-gatherer into our agricultural societies, that we had to figure out a way to control people. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, religion does predate the agricultural revolution, meaning that people were celebrating deities prior to settling down and having farms and stopping their nomadic lifestyles. So perhaps the religion did predate it. Perhaps it is, like you said, that the philosophy predated it and then the rules came. But I still think that religion is very, very much used to make people abide by things. Like you see it in Leviticus. So in the Old Testament, there's a book called Leviticus, and it tells you can't eat pork. Why can't you eat pork? Well, back then, they didn't know about trichinosis. All they knew was that people would eat pork and then suddenly they would be dead. Or somebody would have, several mistresses and be very promiscuous and suddenly they would be crazy. They didn't know about syphilis, but they just knew that this person had been very sexually active and all of a sudden they were going crazy. So there you have, no sex before marriage. And I also think they were promoting families as well. I think there's, several things that were coming out of that, but you have that. And then you have, not being able to wear mixed clothes. So like you couldn't wear a shirt or a tunic or something that was made from both cotton. They had to have their clothes be either 100% cotton or 100% linen. And why is that? Because if your child has outgrown their clothes and you already have this one piece of clothing that's cotton, but now linen's a cheaper product for you to buy, that means that you can buy 6 inches of linen to supplement the cotton that you already have. So you're not stimulating the economy. But if they say, well, you can't have those mixed textiles, now you suddenly have to go out to your linen manufacturer, I don't know what to call them, tradesmen, and buy all of the fabric that you need to remake your child's dress. So you're stimulating that economy. So that's another rule and another way to control the population and control people. So you're keeping them safe, you're making families, you're keeping them from getting venereal diseases, and you're also keeping them, making the economy move a little bit faster so that you don't get, a lot of poor merchants. And of course there's other rules as well, but I think that you have to have the rules within the religion, because how else are you going to get them to adhere to you? Because you can't control, you wouldn't know. You would have no idea if that random woman's daughter was wearing 100% cotton or 50% cotton and 50% linen. All you would know is that she's wearing a dress. Whereas if God who is omniscient and all powerful is saying, well, you can't do this or you can't do that, there's that fear that you're going to go to hell. And hell is not believed, like there is no such concept as hell in the Jewish faith, but there is in the Christian and Islamic faiths. So perhaps it's, perhaps the hell thing wasn't, that big of a deal. I don't know what Jews believe is going to happen if they don't follow these rules, but it's not good. God smited everybody. Like in the Old Testament, in the Torah, God is not merciful or kind.
There's actually a concept of heaven and hell in Hinduism.
Is there?
Yes, Swarg and Narg. So we do have a concept of heaven and hell. Yes. There's also a concept of reincarnation.
Right.
And the idea that you have to go through all the organisms before you become a human again.
Okay.
So the fear-based system there is that, well, because reincarnation is a thing, so what will you be afraid of?
Right.
What you don't achieve in this life, you can achieve in the next one, or whatever, right? But the idea is like, if you are greedy, you're going to end up as this creature. If you're this, then you're going to end up as an ant or something like that.
Right.
There are these old folk stories where if you're very greedy, you're going to turn into a dog. Because a dog always has his mouth open and
he's always begging.
Always begging. Yeah. So like you will turn into a dog. Like there's always.
I mean, that sounds like a good life to me.
In modern day, sure, yes. I know some people's dogs that live a better life than I do. not a big fan, but yeah, it is. Yes, like you said, it would be like statistically in America, it would be a good life to have. But what I'm saying is that there was this idea that you're gonna turn into something if you don't do something, and then that school of thought also progressed based on how society progressed, and it would be like, hey, if you don't go to school, you will end up as this specific type of job or something,
Right.
or you won't
You'll be working at McDonald's your whole life.
something like that.
Yeah.
Right.
Not that there's anything wrong with that, but
Exactly,
some
but
people.
but then it was used in a way
Yeah.
to like now control people to go to school,
Right.
or to do something. Like I've seen people that go to school here that work at McDonald's part-time to support their school.
Of course.
Right.
common.
So it's like what so like if people don't travel much, they don't get exposed to like, hey, it's not really that big of a deal to work at McDonald's.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of people do it. A lot of educated people also do it. So it's not a job for illiterate people.
Right.
Right? Because you're behind the cash register and you have to do math on a constant basis. You have to like strategize, do all of that, right? So in that way, like the more you travel, the more you learn.
Right.
And the more you learn, the less ignorant you get.
Right.
And
I think the more open-minded you are too.
Right. And the translations now make different sense in your head than they used to, which then is like, oh, well, even they live a life that is similar to mine, but they believe in something else and I believe in something else. Or maybe there's so many common things that we share, common struggles that we share.
Yeah, I mean, I've traveled pretty extensively. I mean, I haven't traveled everywhere, but I've been several places, and I always feel like there's more similarities than not. Like I feel less commonalities with certain members of the United States than I do with people of other cultures. Because I feel like I was born and raised into a very, very traditional family. Like I feel like I was born and raised in like a 1940s style household. There's nothing wrong with that, but it just means that like I don't identify with people who are like, Britney Spears was the best, because like I didn't grow up listening to Britney Spears, even though I'm of the age that I should have been listening to it. That just wasn't on my radar. I was raised Methodist, which the church is now splitting right now. And my father's family is historically Quaker. So I was raised in a very, very religious, conservative household with, actually very open-mindedness. Like there was a lot of open-mindedness in my family for sure. So I think that's why I was able to travel and do the things that I have done, and I think that's why I've come to the conclusion that for myself, I don't believe in organized religion. It works for some people, and that's great, but for me, it's just not something that I'm interested in. And I think also studying the history, because I am obsessed with first century Middle Eastern and especially Christian religion, but like Middle Eastern history. So very much focused on the Mediterranean, Rome, Egypt, and modern day Israel and Syria, and all the places that all the important Christian things happened.
Yeah. So you were talking about your travels. Something just hit me.
Yeah.
So there's like a school of thought that Jesus traveled a lot before he became the Messiah. Mm-hmm. Like I was talking to somebody and they brought it to my attention that there are parts of his life missing from I think from age 12, 13 to all the way
until like 30.
Like 30 when he comes back on a donkey.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, it's a little more nuanced than that. The donkey thing is like the last week before his life, so he does show up prior to that. It's because he was 33 when he died. Now, I do want to preface this with, we really don't have any evidence for historical Jesus, except for an ossuary that was recently discovered. And from, I believe it was like 2005 or 6 until like 2012, this ossuary was being like there was a lawsuit in Israel, basically. Like there was a man who discovered this, and they thought that he forged it, and they thought that he had made a modern recreation of this ossuary. And the translation on the ossuary, I believe that it is written in Aramaic and not Hebrew, so Aramaic would have been the native tongue of Jesus. But the ossuary says that it's James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. So that is really the only historical evidence that we have that Jesus was a real person. And some scholars still debate this, but the lawsuit that happened in those like 5 to 6 years did decide that this was not a forgery made by the man who created it. So it still could be a forgery, but it has been determined that it does date back to the 1st century CE, Common Era, also known as AD. But I do want to just preface that we don't know for sure. So you're right. We have the birth of Jesus. We have a couple things about him in his childhood. There's a very interesting book, I believe is called the Infantile Book of Thomas, which was one of the books of the Bible that was not written or like not canonized. So it's not part of any of the modern day Bibles. It's not part of the Catholic Bible, Protestant Bible, King James Bible, none of it. And it talks about Jesus when he was a little boy. And when Jesus was a little boy, he still had his powers of, miracles happening and curing people and such. So this story in the Infantile Book of Thomas says something along the lines of, Jesus was playing with his friends. Jesus killed his friends because he didn't win the game. Mary came out and was like, Jesus, you can't kill your friends. And Jesus was like, oh, sorry, Mom. And then he resurrected all of them. Not canonized, and I'm pretty sure you see why it wasn't canonized.
Okay, that just got dark.
So you can read it. Like, the theology library at Emory University has a copy of it, and or maybe not a copy, but they have it available for you, so you can read it. I believe you can also find it online. So it's out there. So if you want to read it, feel free. Because that was definitely a synopsis and in 21st century lingo and not what it actually says. So we don't have much between like that. That was maybe age 5 or 6. Then we see him again when he's about 12 and he's in the temple and he's teaching the rabbis. And then we don't see him again until he's about 30. And so there's a very large gap. And you're right, there is a theory that he traveled because he spoke Greek, he spoke Aramaic, he spoke Latin, I'm pretty sure. I don't want to make that up, but I know he spoke at least Aramaic and Greek. And why would the son of a carpenter know all these languages? How could he be so well educated? Especially because he himself did not declare that he was the son of God. He did say that, but he said it one time, and he was basically saying like, I'm the son of God, just like you're the son of God. It wasn't like I am the Messiah type of situation.
Right. So yeah, the hypothesis I was talking about, and there's like a big school of thought on this, that he actually traveled to Egypt, to Syria, to Greece, to many other places, making his way into India as well. Because back then, Buddhism had traveled in the opposite direction, and there's this idea that he traveled to the direction of where Buddhism comes from. So his teachings, when he came back, also have Buddhist influences, and the fact that there's a book called The Christ of India.
Okay.
It's an actual book, and that has a lot of information of some historical facts here and there, and some historical findings here and there, which they kind of pieced together in trying to create a timeline of how there would have been a presence of Christ in India before he came back and spread the word.
Oh, that's really. I would love to read that book. I'll have to look at the library when we're done recording. I don't know much about that gap. I mean, nobody really knows a lot about that gap in time. I've heard the theory before that he potentially went to India, picked up some Buddhist beliefs and brought them back. But I really don't know anything about it.
Right. So there's a lot to unpack over there as well. Like I don't think it is backed by like there's no documentation on this, and there's nothing that actually got written about this. But there's so many things that happened around that time, and when you piece all of this data together, it kind of feels like he did do a lot of travels.
Well, we know that he did travel, at least some, right? Because
towards India.
Well, I mean, technically, we know that he traveled towards India because we know that he was born in Bethlehem, that he was from Nazareth. We know that he spent time in Galilee. So this is all in what's modern day Israel. But we also know that he was in Damascus. We also know that he was in parts of modern day Jordan. Like he was baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. So we know, and which direction is Jordan from Israel? It's toward India. So like we do know that even though these are all places that are very close together geographically, we do know that he had some travels. And when we're looking at the apostles as well, so when we're looking at Peter, like he was the person who was the rock upon which I shall build my church. And so that's the Vatican. Vatican is allegedly built on top of like Peter's resting place. We know that Paul, who never knew Jesus, this is like a real sticking point to me because he wrote 13 books of the Bible, including 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which 2nd Corinthians is always at every single Christian wedding ever, because that's the love is patient, love is kind passage.
Okay.
So Paul never knew Jesus. In fact, he was born in Tarsus in modern day Turkey, named Saul. He was a Jew, but he worked for the Roman Empire. He was actively trying to kill the followers of Jesus. And then there's a folk tale, that's in the Bible, but there's a folk tale, that he went blind. And as he was chasing some of the apostles to kill them or arrest them and then have them crucified, and he went blind for 3 days, and the other apostles got away, and then he was given his sight back, and he said, "Oh, thank you, Jesus, for giving me my sight back," because this was like 3 or 4 years after Jesus' death, and he was like, "Thank you for giving me my sight back. I will now praise you forever." And then he went on to write 13 books of the Bible, and he never knew any of the teachings of Jesus. Jesus actively said, and I believe this is in the book of Acts, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it's in Acts, that Jesus says that his brother James of the ossuary is going to be the person to take on the role of leader of his movement. And James did end up becoming a very prominent member of the church inside of Jerusalem. But he's kind of been erased from history. Most people don't even know that James existed. Most people don't know Jesus had brothers. Mary and Joseph had children after Jesus was born. They do believe that there were women as well, but the women have been erased from history. But the brothers followed Jesus, and James was one of them. And he did take on a lot of the roles, and he was stoned to death. When was that? I want to say that was like maybe 6 years after Paul the Apostle, who wrote the 13 books, was killed. So Paul was traveling all over. Paul was all over the Mediterranean, and that's what the books are. The books that he wrote, like Corinthians, for example, those were letters that he were writing to the people of Corinth. So he made all of these people into Christians and into believers, and even when he was jailed in Rome, he was writing letters. And that's something that a lot of very religious Christians will say is like, oh my God, Paul loved Jesus so much that even when he was in jail, even when he was on his deathbed, he was writing these love letters to Christ to all of the people throughout the land that he had converted. And I'm just like, but we're using his love letters as doctrine, saying that Jesus said these things, and Jesus never met this man. And this man was actively trying to kill the followers of Jesus, and yet he's the one who really built the religion.
So I'll tell you, there are so many stories like these. So a lot of Hinduism also comes from a lot of texts that are written by people that were outside the law. Didn't really meet these deities or gods or messiahs or whatever, but have stories written that are incorporated into the religion.
Really?
Yes, one of them is Valmiki. He was actually an outlaw.
Okay.
Who has
so like Jesse James.
Yeah, something like that, right? The Wild Wild East. But he also has a big role in shaping how Hinduism is today. And there's so many stories of God appearing in people's dreams, and telling them something.
Sure.
Like we did mention Noah's Ark.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what Noah's Ark story is, or do you know it?
Yeah, I mean, I know Noah's Ark story. So Noah was basically told by God, like, hey, you believe in me, so and you're a pious man, like you've done very few things wrong in life, so I just want to warn you that I'm going to flood the world, and I want you and your family to be safe because you are a good man. So you need to build an ark. And so God then gave him the dimensions that was necessary to build this ark, and he said, take all the animals that you can find and take them two of a kind so that you can repopulate the world afterwards. So obviously he built the ark in the dimensions that God had given him. He gathered up as many animals as he possibly could. Like there's actually like this folk tale that's not in the Bible, but it's just like part of like Christian like tradition, is that unicorns wouldn't get on the boat, and that's why we don't have unicorns anymore. Like they allegedly were, here once upon a time, but Noah just couldn't convince them to get on the boat. So now we have no unicorns. So he put all the animals and everything on the ark. And so for 40 days and 40 nights, it rained and it rained and it rained. And the whole world was flooded. And Noah and his wife and his sons were the only ones left, along with the animals of two of a kind that he had on the boat. And when the 40 days and nights were up, Noah decided, it's probably about time for us to get off this boat. We just have to find some dry land. Surely the floodwaters are receding. So he sent out, I believe it was a raven or a crow. And the crow came back and, nothing. And so he did it for several days. He sent out, a blackbird to try to see if there was any land. And after some time, he was like, well, these birds just must be stupid. Like, I am going to send out a dove. So then he sent out a dove, and the dove came, and they had an olive branch in its beak or in its talons or something. And he was like, okay, dry land. And so then they found the dry land, and they went, and they got off the boat. And then they were rejoicing and partying and trying to repopulate the earth with, mom and sisters and brothers and whatnot. And Noah was drinking pretty heavily, and his three sons, was it Shem, Ham, and Japheth, I believe, are the three sons. And Ham saw his father dancing naked and drunken and did nothing. He was just a warrior and just watched it. And so God cursed him for not helping his father. And then the other two brothers did help him, and they were blessed. And so that's how the world got repopulated, according to Christian tradition.
Yeah, so there are similar stories in ancient Mesopotamia, in the Aztecs, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Chinese and Greek. Like there are similar flood stories. And a lot of people actually believe that that's how the world was repopulated. I'm guessing like there were a lot of cataclysmic events back in the day, like even after the ice age, when maybe like there was a meteor shower and the ice walls dropped and then there was a flood. Like there were so many different events, right? That caused the canyons that we look at today. All those are flood related structures that were created. So it is highly possible that these flood stories were taken from one place to another place, and then they got evolved into stories that were associated to those people,
right.
And then they formed stories around it. So I feel a lot of stories in various religious texts are basically metaphors. Like it's like one of those, like folk tales, like there's a story and here's the moral that, thou shalt not kill people, or, thou shalt respect people, or whatever, right? That could be like the end goal of these stories. And a lot of people put too much focus on the stories and the existence of stories rather than the teachings that come from these stories.
Yeah.
Like if you look at any childhood storybooks, right? Like even Cinderella.
Yeah.
Right?
It's definitely a fable.
Right. Right? And it has a moral at the end of it. Yeah. Like, hey, that's how you should do. Like, if the shoe fits, not wear it.
Right. Don't cut off your toes or your heels to try to get your foot in the shoe.
Exactly.
Yeah. But your prince will come.
Right. So that's how that is. Or that you have like other stories like kiss a frog and it'll turn into a prince or whatever. Yeah. But the idea is like like give people chances. They might end up being the people that you need that will help you in your life, or the people that you need in your life. But give people a chance. So that could be like the moral of that story instead of be a fuckboy. What we try to
don't sleep with your daughters.
And that.
Or don't witness your father sleeping with your sister and then do nothing. You will be cursed.
And that. Right? So yeah, see something, say something, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what I feel like we need to understand.
Yeah.
That they're just, the stories are just stories.
Definitely.
And instead of focusing on the validity of the stories, focus more on the teachings of those stories rather than,
Well, that's actually a very Jewish perspective that you just outlined. Because the Jewish faith doesn't believe in the Torah or the Old Testament, like at face value, right? Like they don't believe that the world is 5,000 years old and that dinosaurs never roamed the earth. They don't believe that the world was like truly built in 7 days with, the first day being light and darkness. Like it's not like that. Like the first verse of Genesis, they don't see it that way. They see it as a series of teachings, a series of ways to live your life in a good manner. Like they aren't taking it literally. I feel like the literal interpretations of religious text is very much a Christian thing. And I don't know where that started. Like I would love to dive more into the research there and see like when Christians especially first started thinking like, oh, well, the 100% of the world must have been flooded. Because for me personally, because there are so many flood stories, it could have been spread the way you said, where one culture talked about their flood story, and then like another culture heard it and they're like, oh, something similar happened here, and so they just take it. Or it could have been that flooding is just a natural occurrence and there's rivers everywhere. There's giant rivers everywhere. So perhaps more likely there's just been significant floods in multiple areas, and there's similar, flood stories that have stemmed out of it. And maybe because people were trying to connect and with the Incense Road and the Silk Road and all the other pathways to globalization, we've just heard these stories, and as we related them to each other, we did, kind of like a fish story, like how it starts out as 6 inches and then suddenly it's 8 and suddenly it's 12 and then it's 16 and then suddenly it's a whale. So, it could be any of those things.
Right. So, we were talking, if you notice, like each of these stories has somebody coming up to somebody and saying there's going to be a flood.
Yeah.
Right. Even in the story of Gilgamesh, right? There's somebody that informs Gilgamesh, somebody informs Noah.
Yeah.
Even in the Aztecs, I think the person was Titlaquan.
I don't know.
I think that was somebody that informed, like there's a storm coming, or there's a flood coming, and in a lot of these stories, that person actually assisted them in building the boat, or sealing the tree bark, or turning into a fish to guide them through the water.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So I think it's in Hinduism, where the person or the entity that tells about the flood is a fish.
Okay.
and then there's a boat that's built. I do want to say it's Hinduism.
Do you think that Noah had to put fish on the boat too, or since the world was flooding, do you think that all of the fish and whales and everything was safe?
There's actually another story where whatever creatures could not get on the boat, they did not die.
Oh,
They just turned into a fish,
Oh, interesting.
or like a type of fish.
Okay.
So the idea is like fishes came after this
Okay.
whole.
I think we need to inform Ken Ham. I don't know if you know who he is. Ken Ham is an Australian Christian extremist, and he lives in the U.S. now, where he's embraced it a little bit more than I think he was embraced in Australia. And he actually built a replica of Noah's Ark in Kentucky. Like, he has dinosaurs on the boat, he has like all these things, and he claims that it is like an exact replica of what Noah would have created. Now, I don't put much stock into Ken Ham, because he is very much an extremist, and not in a good way. And there's documentaries about him, and he has his own documentaries spreading his own belief systems. It's really quite fascinating, but I watched a documentary several weeks ago with some family members, and they actually did recreate an ark in a way that Noah would have had access to all of the materials. And scholars now believe, and when they rebuilt it, it worked. It floated. They were able to get several tons of things on there, because you have to deal with feeding all of the animals. You can't just put animals on a boat for 40 days and 40 nights without food. So they did test this, and they believe now that that Noah's Ark was actually fully round vessel. And I just find that really fascinating. And that is not what Ken Ham built in Kentucky, but if you want to go see it for yourself, you can.
Okay, so yeah, I just looked it up. It was the Aztecs.
Okay.
And in that culture, everybody turns into a fish.
Oh, I have heard that. When I was a little kid, like, we had to read Native American stories, and there's one about the world being on the back of a turtle, and then there was one that we also had to read about that. Yeah, people there were fish, or like people came from fish, or people turned into a fish. I do have like a very vague memory of like second grade reading a story about that.
Are you thinking about that, or are you thinking about Black Panther, the latest movie?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
There's a lot of Aztec reference into that.
There is, yeah.
And what's the name of the antagonist?
Oh, I don't know.
Titlaquan.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Is it? I know they're blue and they have a lot of Aztec, and they're like fish people.
Yes. So it is after a meteor strike. That's when
that's how they get
the vibranium. Yeah. So there's like a lot of reference to the Aztec stories.
Yeah.
In that. And one thing about Noah's Ark is that there's an old Buddhist story, right, about a similar flood.
Mm-hmm.
But this flood involves, take a guess, carpenters.
Interesting.
Right. So the story goes that these carpenters were not really, they were very corrupt, right? And they wanted to, they were cheating people. They would say that, oh, we will build something for you, but not deliver, mm-hmm. right? And then they were cast away to this other island, and there were two gods that showed up. That island was full of spirits. And the idea was that you're not allowed to defecate anywhere on the island. If you do, then you need to dig a hole, defecate, and then close it up, because we want the island to be clean. Right?
Like cats.
Something like that. Right. And one of the spirits notices them having parties and doing trashing the whole island. And then they say that, that spirit says, because you did all of this, there's going to be a flood on a specific island. So now, the entire world is not getting drowned. It's just the island, mm-hmm. right? And that's going to happen, and you need to leave. Mm-hmm. And there's another spirit that says, if we tell them to leave, they will take this corruption somewhere else. So this spirit tells the carpenters, haha, just kidding. It's not going to happen. So these carpenters get divided into two sections, where one builds a boat to get out of there, and the other group kind of gets drowned.
Oh, interesting.
So, like, you see how there's like this idea of Noah's Ark and carpenters being
Yeah.
part of the same story as another carpenter
Right.
and a boat
Yeah.
and a flood story.
Right. Well, there's a couple things that it reminded me of. So one is that when we think of carpenters, we think of woodworking, but in Nazareth and in Galilee, where Jesus spent most of his childhood, there weren't a lot of trees, so really the carpentry is probably not the right translation. They actually think that he worked with stone, like more like a stonemason. But the other thing is that I don't know how familiar you are with the story of Lot and his wife. So Lot is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So Sodom and Gomorrah were two ancient cities that were destroyed by fire and brimstone. And they actually have proven that this happened, but it was a meteor shower. It wasn't actually God smiting the people. But the story that's in the Old Testament of the Bible, so it also appears in the Torah, and as far as I know, it also appears in, it definitely appears in the Quran. So Lot is traveling and he goes with his wife to Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, they're two separate cities, so I don't remember which one he went to first. But he went to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah seeking refuge. Like, he needed a place to stay for the night. Hospitality is like the number one rule in Middle Eastern culture to this day. So like, you're expected to be hospitable, provide maybe a meal, provide shelter if you can. If you can't, then help them find somebody where they can bed down for the night. So allegedly in Sodom and Gomorrah, people were having sex outside of marriage. They were doing all kinds of sinful things. And that's also where we get, some of our words today, like sodomy. So they claim that, in Sodom, they were sodomizing each other. So Lot and his wife are there, and God tells Lot, don't stay here. You can't stay here tonight. Like, if you do, then bad things are going to happen. So Lot and his wife are like, okay, God, like, we'll listen to you. And so they decide to flee the city. And as they start to flee, fire comes raining down on the city, and the city starts getting destroyed. And God says to Lot and his wife, do not look back. If you look back, if you go back, bad things will happen. Save yourselves. And so as they escape the cities, Lot's wife turns around and looks to see what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. So again, this is Old Testament, so God is not the warm, loving God that we see in the New Testament, but he turns his wife into a pillar of salt. So there's actually a rock formation, and I'm forgetting which country this is in modern day, but there's a rock formation that's always been called Lot's wife. And from there, they actually found the cities. They found the destroyed cities that actually date back to the time that they believed. And the reason why they knew it was a meteor shower, besides finding the actual, pumice stones, whatever you call the like space rocks, the Babylonians kept track of the star formations. And they actually had tablets of the meteors coming down. So they were able to date this and then check it, like cross-reference it with the Babylonian tiles and with the archaeological evidence that they found at these two sites, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty cool. Well, humans have always been fascinated with the stars and the night sky, and there's so many stories. There's so many ways in which humans have depicted the celestial bodies.
Right.
Like you take it anywhere from the Stonehenge to recently found various archaeological sites where they're actually facing certain days or certain times of a celestial body moving, or its entire cycle or orbit, or however you want to describe that. But yeah, it's fascinating that there is we know about the Library of Alexandria being burned, right?
Yeah.
During the Civil
I'm
War.
so sad about that.
Yeah.
Like, I'm never not going to be over that. Like,
But there is another library that we don't know about, or which is not popular enough. It's the Nalanda University. It was in India, which also got burned down, and they had a separate section of astronomy
that makes sense.
as a different branch of science way before you hear about it in the modern times.
Wow.
Right? Before there was even a telescope.
Mm-hmm.
Like there have been calculations that are so insane. Like I don't know if you noticed that the number 108 is very very holy in Hindu religion.
I did not know that. So 108.
108, yes. This number has a lot of different things attached to it religiously.
Okay.
But astronomically, I think there was like there was a research paper I was reading up on this, that how this either the circumference of the Earth's ratio to its diameter or its distance from the sun. There's like so many different things in our solar system which are connected between the Earth, its shape, size, and distance from the sun, and the sun's shape, and all of that, including the moon. All of them are connected to each other with a ratio of 108.
Oh wow!
And all of this is before telescope.
Almost like the Fibonacci sequence or like the golden rule.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And then there was a lot of knowledge that got lost because of
The fire,
these things burning down or whatever. And there is a theory that there was more evidence of the existence of the underwater city of
Atlantis.
Yes.
There's been several archaeological digs in the Iowan Sea.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting to read about or to watch documentaries on. There's a couple different locations that they believe might have been, and they have found a couple sunken cities in their archaeological, is it called archaeology when it's under the water? I'm not sure.
I don't know. I call anything digging up archaeology.
Yeah. So they have found some sunken cities, which I also think is interesting. And part of Alexandria also sunk.
Right. So there's a documentary on Netflix. I think Graham Hancock has that one. And one of the things that he mentions is that the last documented mention of Alexandria was by Plato.
Okay.
And Plato got this story from Aristotle.
Okay.
Who heard this story about somebody traveling to a place where the people over there had local stories of Alexandria drowning.
Are you talking Alexandria or are you talking?
Sorry, my bad. Atlantis.
Okay. Yeah.
Of Atlantis drowning, and then if we piece together all the dates and times, it comes out to 11,600 BC.
Right before the flood.
Exactly. So there is like the timeline just matches.
Yeah.
So there's a huge possibility based on the stories that were passed down that Atlantis could have been a city, and they did not. Maybe their architecture was not that great, or maybe the people were too egotistical of how great their city was. Sure. There were so many hypotheses around it, right? And that's why the city drawn and people they're drawn to. Just like, what is that city on the top of a mountain or a hill?
Oa? So like Santorini?
No. It's the Inca people made it.
Oh.
And then they died off within 100 years.
Yeah, I know what you're
I think
talking
Machu Picchu?
Well, Machu Picchu is
a city on a hill type.
I don't know if people died.
Yeah, that civilization got wiped out pretty quickly. They did have a city built higher than most cities around there, and that kind of they felt that it was such a great civilization that maybe they did not account for certain things, including how do we get resources
Right.
all the way up here, and
Right.
all of that.
Or it could have been smallpox. You never know. Maybe
Or that.
maybe the conquistadors had come at that point and brought the blankets and smallpox.
And they did not know where to go from there,
Yeah.
because they thought they were so well protected
Yeah.
from everything around
Yeah.
that they did not have an escape route, and just within 100 years after them creating that city, they just kind of died off.
Like, I don't know if like the timelines add up for Spain, conquering that part of the world.
It is highly possible. It is
Yeah.
highly possible.
Well, I know like the Aztecs, for example, like they, the reason why they fell so quickly was because all of the other tribes hated them, and the Spanish wanted the land, and so the Spanish just aligned themselves with the other tribes, and they were like, hey, you scratch our back, we'll scratch yours. And honestly, the Spanish were really smart about how they went about doing everything, because they married into the tribes. Like the way that the U.S., what's modern day U.S. Did like with the Native Americans was not nearly as smart. Like the Spanish, they married in and they converted them to Catholicism so that they were far more likely to embrace them, and we did not do anything nearly so kind.
Yeah, that happens.
Yeah.
Are you ready to land this? All right, let's land this plane. It was lovely talking to you,
Yeah,
and
thanks
I
for
would
having
definitely
me.
want to come back and have another conversation with me.
Oh, we need to talk about the Council of Rome, the Council of Nicaea. There's a lot more to go.
All right. Yes. We could definitely have another episode on that. But yeah, it's lovely having you here, and thank you. I don't know why we're shaking hands,
we've
but
known each
sure.
other forever.
All right. All right.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Ciao.